Hey guys, welcome to the channel. Michael Noland here, and tonight I rank all 13 Beatle albums. Now, if you've had a chance to visit my channel page under playlists, I have an entire series covering the Beatles albums. Thus far, I have videos covering their very first album and all the way up to and including Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And of course, on that playlist is a three-part series where I cover Peter Jackson's Get Back, playing on Disney+. On that series, in part 2 especially and beyond, we discuss the Let It Be album in quite a bit of detail. Alright, so in regard to my new series, Beatles Unlocked, this is more or less an introductory video. Before we got any further into the Beatles story, I thought I'd give my rankings on all 13 Beatle albums released. Now, it's interesting that the Beatles released 13 albums. What Beatles album could possibly hold the unlucky 13th position? Well, for me, and probably for a whole lot of you, that dubious positioning has to go to the Beatles album, Yellow Submarine. Now, it's interesting with this album. To me, the Beatles chose to take on almost an Americanism here. You see, prior to this release, America was famous for messing around with the Beatles' original release, thus making extra albums available to their fans and making more money in the deal. And this was especially true with their film albums, wasn't it? Side 1 containing the music from the films, and side 2 containing incidental music from the film as well. These weren't the original release forms for these albums. But you know, here, curiously, with Yellow Submarine, we see the Beatles releasing a product just like they would in America. It's on side 1 where we have songs from the film, and on side 2 we have George Martin incidental music. So that only left side 1 for Beatle music, and we didn't get the very best Beatle music in this case. All You Need Is Love was a wonderful cut, but we had heard it before, both as a single, and it would wind up on another album as well. By the way, George has the most cuts on this album. The only time that George Harrison actually dominated a Beatle album. And historically, these cuts are very interesting, but they cannot be relied on to carry the bulk of this album. Altogether Now by Paul McCartney at best was a McCartney throwaway. But you know, there's no album where you can't find at least one hidden gem, and it is for this next song that I even bothered to purchase this album, and that was for the wonderful Hey Bulldog by John Lennon. All right, next up in the number 12 position, I put Beatles for Sale. Now, this is an important album. There are some really interesting cuts on this album. John Lennon does an amazing amount of growth as a songwriter on this album, but we wouldn't be seeing the very best of such newly picked fruits until the next album, Help, and fully, really majestically reached on Rubber Soul. But the real disappointment to this album for me is when the Beatles chose to go back to covering so many songs and only giving us so many original songs by the Beatles themselves. They had done this on their first album, they had done this on their second album, and we'll talk more about that later. These are some of the weakest covers the Beatles chose to actually cover. At number 11, I choose Meet the Beatles. Now, Meet the Beatles is an important album. It's on Meet the Beatles, you see, that the recording team for the Beatles start really developing that Beatle sound. Where it was only hinted at in their first release, it is more well developed on this album. That alone makes this album worth a listen. Of course, some of the material on this album is top-notch, but once again, the reason that I have chosen this album so low is because of the ratio of Beatle original material versus that which they chose to cover. At number 10, I know I'm going to get some pushback. Some people rank this album much higher, but I urge you to take a look at my video on the album Help. It's in that video where I call this album a near masterpiece. And I get into, on that video, as I do in all of my other Beatle videos, into the specifics on why I think that album is a near masterpiece, not quite a masterpiece. But one of the reasons will sound very familiar to you in this video, and of course that reason is because the Beatles again, for the fourth time, chose to go to an already dry well, songs that they could cover because they didn't have the original material to produce a full album. They were busy, you understand. They were recording an album and making a movie at the same time. And the original Beatle music on Help is some of the very best the Beatles ever produced. You know, it's with my number 9 ranking I want to bring out. Albums from number 9 on are Beatle classic albums. And at number 9, I choose Please Please Me, the Beatles' very first album. Not only are the covers much stronger on this album, but the Beatles' original material here is wonderful. Now you have to understand, George Martin chose to record an album for the Beatles at this point. They only had a couple of singles out, and at first he was just going to do a live album, but he changed his mind when he took a look at the cavern and how well the cavern could be recorded. With too many acoustic problems there, he chose to bring the boys into Abbey Road Studios and record it there, but to approach the entire recording with an immediacy. And boy, did the Beatles deliver. This album was recorded in less than 13 hours, less than 24 hours if you take into consideration the extra recording time for the 2 singles or 4 cuts on the album that were already in the can. An album recorded in about 24 hours? Are you even freaking kidding me? You know, in my estimation, only Led Zeppelin ever came close to accomplishing this on record. And that, of course, was their magnificent first album, Led Zeppelin, an album that Jimmy Page not only financed, but produced and recorded in less than 30 hours. At number 8, Let It Be. Now, you know, for Let It Be, we're kind of in the middle of the list here, aren't we? And I think this is a very fair place to place this album. If you've seen my videos on Peter Jackson's Get Back, you know I love Let It Be. I love the original release, Let It Be, and I love Let It Be Naked even a bit more. For all of my reasonings for that, take a look at that set of videos. Now, Let It Be is also an album that is not very popular with more casual Beatle fans. And to them, alls I can say, are you freaking kidding me? Any album that has the songs Across the Universe, Let It Be, Long Winding Road, Get Back, as well as John Lennon's One After 909 is a winner in my ears every single time. And on Let It Be Naked, they even bring in John Lennon's magnificent Don't Let Me Down. All right, so with number 7, a lot of people won't agree with my choosing to place this album as high as I have, but I choose Magical Mystery Tour as my 7th favorite and best Beatle album. Now, the whole approach and release of this album is a very interesting tale. You know how we brought up that in Yellow Submarine, the Beatles kind of took on the American approach in how they released that album. On this album, they didn't even bother to release an album. Originally, this was a double EP release in England. America, as usual, would take whatever the Beatles had recorded and remix it into one of their concoctions, right? But this time, they got it right. This is one of the most powerful and most easy to listen Beatle albums that I could possibly name. And you know, it's with the release of Yellow Submarine and this album that the Beatles actually wound up with a psychedelic period to their music. Even the more obscure cuts on this album, Baby You're a Rich Man, wonderful. All right, that leads us to number 6, and that is the Beatles' very first masterpiece they ever created, the magnificent A Hard Day's Night. Only the Beatles' third album, and here the Beatles turn in their very first masterpiece for their fans to consider. Not only is this album a masterpiece, but you ask any film critic, and A Hard Day's Night is often in their top 10 of favorite films, regardless of genre. Now, up until a certain point, the Beatles always released 14 cuts, 7 songs per side. And A Hard Day's Night kind of follows that rule, but falls shy of 1 song. But these 13 cuts, what magnificent music. First of all, John Lennon writes 10 of these 13 songs. Paul hadn't quite asserted himself as he would in the future at this point, and John was the dominant writer at this point. But take a look at the 3 songs by Paul McCartney. They each one are as clearly as good as any of the 3 best Lennon cuts that you could ever choose from this album. This album, A Hard Day's Night, still early Beatles, a masterpiece and pure magic. Okay, so that leads us to the number 5 position, and in this position a lot of people aren't going to agree with me. I placed the magnificent Abbey Road. Now, first of all, I want to make something very clear about what I feel about Abbey Road. If you asked me which is the very best Beatle album ever produced, Abbey Road would be my answer. When you consider the song strength on this album, as well as the amount of studio trickery and an ever-expanded 16-track board, this has got to be, hands down, the Beatles' best album. It even falls in being one of their most artistic albums, especially when you consider their symphonic approach on side 2. You know, it was John Lennon who said that his favorite cuts from this album were both by George Harrison. George Harrison gets his first A-side with the Beatles on the Magnificent Something, shooting that song straight to number 1, and they give him the honor of introducing side 2 with the magnificent Here Comes the Sun. All right, so it's at number 4 where I know I'm going to get into trouble. Many people consider this not only the Beatles' greatest album, but rock's greatest album of all time, and that is the magnificent Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This album is a pinnacle album in rock. You know, it's on this album where Paul McCartney really starts to dominate for the first time. This was a little bit of a departure as far as what we were hearing from the Beatles. This album, no matter what you think of it, is very Paul-centric. Even on John Lennon's best stuff on this album, Paul has his fingers, as usual, in the pot. Evidently, according to John Lennon, it was Paul's idea to include the lyrics, "Newspaper taxis appear on the shore." If that's true, wonderful writing, Paul. And though John Lennon's output on this album is not equal to Paul at all, his stuff is the stuff you seem to remember when you talk about this album with your friends. With the magnificent album ending on John Lennon and Paul McCartney's co-written and wonderful magnus opus, A Day in the Life, all you want to do is turn that disc over and start it all over again. All right, that leads us to the top 3. What 3 albums could I possibly argue over Abbey Road, and Sgt. Pepper. Well, if you've been keeping track, I think you already probably have a hint of where I'm going here. At number 3 is an album, the White Album. All right, so first of all, you have to understand, for decades, this was my favorite Beatle album. I would often tell friends that if I was stuck on a desert island, I would take with me the Beatles' White Album and Houses of the Holy by Led Zeppelin. But if you gave me any 2 Beatle discs to make up for the fact that this is a double album, my choice would be a bit different. Here we see John Lennon returning to a real dominance as far as his output on an album. In fact, I think he beats Paul by 1 song on this album. But then again, Paul has that "Can You Take Me Back Where I Came From" section. So about a 50-50 written album by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, with George Harrison supplying 4 songs and Ringo 1. Now, the reason I've always loved this album and the reason it was my number 1 choice for so long is it's only on this album that you see the Beatles go from one extreme to another, almost cut to cut. You have the silly obla-dee, obla-da, the very cryptic, and we really need to discuss the lyrics in Happiness is a Warm Gun someday. George Harrison stepping up 4 times, 4 magnificent songs, but 1 song taking center stage practically of the whole album, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. You've got that rock attack of Back in the USSR and Birthday, the heavy power blues of Your Blues by John Lennon, as well as several classics written by Paul McCartney that have been in more movie soundtracks than I care to remember. The only mar on this album to me, and I'm sorry, I've never been a Revolution number 9 fan. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned in my part 2 of the Get Back video, one of the gravest errors the Beatles ever made was not including George Harrison's magnificent Not Guilty on this album. All right, so that leaves us to the number 2 spot, and in my number 2 spot is an album that has been known to defeat both Sgt. Pepper and the Beach Boys' magnificent Pet Sounds as the greatest album of rock and roll. Now I'm talking about the magnificent Revolver album. Now this album is the first album in Beatle history where Paul McCartney starts to take a slight dominance in the songwriting output. Not much, about 1.5 songs on this album, but it is the first time that Paul slightly dominated John, and his output on this album is magnificent. It includes my favorite Beatle track of all time, Eleanor Rigby, Paul's magnificent For No One, but not only those magnificent cuts, we have John Lennon projecting the Beatles into the future on this album, first hinting at it with a magnificent She Said, She Said, a song that he wrote around a very uncomfortable conversation that he had with actor Peter Fonda. But he really sells the point on the wonderful Tomorrow Never Knows. Now the studio trickery on this cut and everything, the sound of it, and it being the very last song on the album, you would think, the Beatles must have just gotten into this, and of course their next album, Sgt. Pepper, is where they really took John's idea and went crazy. But that's not what happened here. Do you know this is one of the very first cuts recorded for this album? All right, that leads us to number 1, and my choice as the Beatles' very finest album is the wonderful Rubber Soul. All right, so first of all, just look at that album cover. The best album cover in rock and roll. The Beatles never looked better than they did on that album cover. This album, of course, preceded Revolver, didn't it? This is the first album that the Beatles, no, not just the Beatles, any rock group, any pop rock act ever intentionally put out as just that, an album. In other words, something to be listened to from cut 1, side 1, to the last cut, Side 2. That was their whole approach to recording this album. And so, with that in mind, isn't this really Rock's? I'm not talking about just rock and roll, but Rock's first true album. And look at the forward movement from Help, which preceded this album. Again, George's songs a full step better than they were on the preceding album. Only this time his input being felt on Lennon and McCartney material. Him taking a very central staging in the song Norwegian Wood. You know, George Harrison once said that Rubber Soul and Revolver were really just part 1 and part 2 of the same album. And so with that in mind, here's a thought experiment for you. Let's say under the old rules where somebody would choose the White Album as their, if you had to go to a desert island, what Beatle album would you choose? Well, that album has 2 LPs, right? So with all of that in mind, here's my question to you. What 2 Beatle LPs would you choose to take with you on a desert island?